So welcome to everybody. I'm really happy to see so many of you and that so many of you have found your way back to our Tuesdays with Team Counterfactual seminar series after the 2-month holiday break over the summer. So this is a virtual seminar series. We run it monthly on the first Tuesday of every month on conservation, impact evaluation and implementation science. And my name is Johan A. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Helsinki. And today's session, I will co-host together with Rachel Martin from the Conservation X Labs. And we are both sitting on the board of the Society for Conservation Biology's Impact Evaluation Working Group. So yeah, really great to see you. And I would like to start by just going through a little bit the details and of the seminar series. Let's see now if I can change my slides. So as many of you probably already know, this is a monthly seminar series. We've already heard seminar presentations from Paul Ferraro and Julia Jones. And today we will continue with Johan Oldekop. And after that, later in the autumn, we will hear from Erin Sills and Sabrina Eisenbart. And then before Christmas, we will end with a panel discussion on challenges and opportunities for implementation science in conservation. But before going into today's talk, I wanted to go through a little bit of housekeeping rules. So we start with the talk. I've asked Johan to give approximately a 30-minute talk. And after that, we will have a moderated Q&A session. And for the Q&A session, because we are so many, you can post questions in the chat, and then Rachel will be moderating those and posing them forward to Johan. Because we also are quite a diverse group of people, if you find it helpful, you should be able to activate the live transcription function in Zoom under the options for more and then live transcript. And then please note that the seminar is being recorded, and the beauty of this is that the recordings will later on be available on the Society for Conservation Biology's Vimeo channel. And if you want to engage with us on social media, which we really encourage, please use the hashtag Tuesdays with Team Counterfactual and tag the Twitter handle IDoImpact. But before we start with today's talk, I just wanted to say a few words about the Impact Evaluation Working Group. So we are one of the newer working groups of the Society for Conservation Biology, and we currently have provisional status. So we are really keen to get more members and see this community grow. Our aim is to advance evidence-based biodiversity conservation efforts across the globe by supporting the adoption and mainstreaming of counterfactual approaches to understanding the impacts of conservation actions and interventions. And if you're interested and want to find out more, then please you can check these links that you can see here. I especially encourage you to sign up for our email list, for example, where we usually kind of like keep in touch with ongoing events or planned upcoming symposium and things like that at conferences. And then I just really happily wanted to highlight that we are in the process of planning to set up a mentoring program, but more about that probably a little bit further into the autumn. So I think we are ready to move over to today's talk. So it's really a great honor to invite Dr. Johan Oldekop, who's the senior lecturer in environment and development at the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester. And I just wanted to mention that Johan has actually been one of the previous board members of the working group as well, so he's well familiar with the community and what we are aiming for. His background is in environmental social sciences, and he has worked on decentralization and poverty alleviation policies, so perhaps kind of coming from a slightly different angles than many of us coming from a conservation background. And he has been looking at the links between natural resource management and social and environmental outcomes in several countries spanning from Southeast Asia to Latin America. So without much further ado, Johan, please, the virtual floor is yours. I will just
Great. Thanks.
Stop sharing my slides so that we can move to yours.
Great. Thanks very much, Johanna, for the introduction. I'm just going to share my screen, and hopefully you should be able to see it. And there we go. You can still all see it? The main title slide?
Perfect.
Okay.
Yep.
Great. Thanks very much for joining, and really a big thank you to Johanna and the other folks at Team Counterfactual for inviting me. It's really a great honor to be put on the same bill and to come after Paul and Julia, who are some of my academic heroes and have really helped define the field of impact evaluation and conservation science. What I want to do in this talk is to present some of the work that I and colleagues have been doing and will continue to do so as part of a new project that I'll briefly mention at the end, which is fundamentally about trying to identify how different policies and socioeconomic contexts shape social and environmental outcomes, mainly in forest landscapes. But I want to start with something that Paul said in the first talk of the series that I found really profound and quite striking. He said that ultimately we have an ethical obligation to better understand the impacts of interventions. And I'm paraphrasing here, he said, we're messing with people's lives and endangered ecosystems, and at the very least, we should do no harm. And I think we are now at an inflection point with a new and very ambitious conservation and restoration targets and agenda that are really likely to influence a quarter of the world's rural population, mostly in low and middle income countries. And I think that while we've been studying the dynamics of conservation and poverty for some time, I think both the data revolution that we're currently in and the tools that Paul and others have helped to mainstream into conservation science provide us with a real opportunity to better understand these dynamics and what works in conservation science and for whom. So the aim for this talk is to focus on two things. The first one is to show you some thinking and some results that I think are challenging some of my assumptions about conservation interventions. And the second is to present you with some reflections about some key challenges that I think we as a community of scientists interested in sustainability issues currently face. The first challenge to my assumptions is that interventions that have smaller average effects can actually lead to larger effects at scale. I've always been interested in what maximizes the average effect, but that's perhaps not really the way in which we should be thinking. The second point is that socioeconomic processes can have similar effects to policies. And in some instances, these effects are large, and I think sometimes we tend to overlook that. Third is that drivers of change and context can interact in ways that either maximize or minimize the effects of the main interventions that we're interested in. And I really think we shouldn't forget that. And finally, that the effects of interventions can be really heterogeneous. And so to better customize and target interventions, I think we really need to better understand how different contexts help to shape different outcomes. So one of the things that I think, let's say that the crunch points that I really want to kind of highlight are how do we measure social outcomes at scale, and how do we measure reforestation or restoration. We've mainly been focusing on deforestation, at least in forest landscapes. And I think these two things are really important in helping us understand these new agendas of both protected area expansion and restoration. Now, the typical approach to impact evaluation in conservation science, I think, has been that we focus on one specific intervention, let's say protected areas, and one outcome. However, I think sustainability is a multidimensional concept, and I think we need to better understand, or to better understand the sustainability implications of conservation policies, And to really live by the edict of doing no harm, we need to be focusing on multiple outcomes simultaneously. But I think the picture gets even a little bit more complicated because policies and interventions often overlap in time and space. And so we not only want to be able to control for multiple interventions, but we also want to be able to compare between interventions. And I think the picture gets even more complicated because interventions don't operate in a vacuum, right? They interact and they have the potential to either potentiate or stymie each other. And we really need to be able to understand how these interventions operate within different contexts in order to better understand what works for whom and where. Now, I know that this conceptual model is a little abstract, but I hope to be able to map some results onto it from some work that we've been doing in Nepal and Brazil, which I hope will add a little bit more clarity. Now, I think Nepal provides a really important case study to understand the social and environmental outcomes of conservation-related interventions. It's a relatively small country, but it has a very large rural population that has depended on forests for much of their livelihoods. And it has one of the longest and largest community forest management programs in the world. I think by the latest count, it's actually about 20,000 community forests. The country also has a large protected area network that covers approximately 20% of the country's land area. And that network supports a large tourism industry, which contributes approximately 7% to the country's GDP. The country also has very large levels of international labor migration, mostly working-age men, and according to the 2011 census, approximately 1 in 3 households had at least one person working abroad and sending back remittances, which have contributed to approximately 1/3 of the country's GDP. And so what we have here are 3 mechanisms with real potential to have substantial effects on both landscapes and the people that depend on them. And here, I also really want to give a shout out to some of my research partners and colleagues, especially Virendra Karna and Kate Sims, who've been extremely generous with their time and expertise. In Brazil, I want to focus on conditional cash transfers and rural credits that were introduced as part of a comprehensive social protection program in the early 2000s. And this was work that was led by one of my colleagues, Cecilia Dingeland, who did her PhD with me. So for Nepal, we're working at the level of individual village development committees, which are equivalent to municipalities in many other countries. And we were able to combine data from the national census to generate multidimensional poverty estimates with remote sensing data and information on our key drivers of change in the country. And one of the things that we find is that all drivers, so community forests, outmigration, and protected areas, affect forests and actually reduce deforestation in the country. And one of the things that we find, or that we see from this graph, is that on average, so at the level of individual municipalities, protected areas seem to be doing much better than community forests and outmigration. But when we actually scale this up to the level of the country and we look at the total effect, so this is essentially summing up the different interventions or the effect of the different interventions across all of the municipalities, that picture actually changes quite dramatically. And we see that community forests and outmigration actually lead to much greater reductions in deforestation across the country. And this is because both community forestry and migration are so ubiquitous in comparison to protected areas, which are perhaps more limited in terms of the amount of space that they cover. And we see a very similar pattern when we look at poverty, where the national effects of community forestry and migration are much larger than those of protected areas. I think that the point that I want to make here is that protected areas, which in this case have the largest average environmental effect, might not be the way to maximize environmental and social benefits at scale. So really kind of thinking about multiple interventions and trying to get a better understanding of how these multiple interventions relate to each other, I think is very important. Now, an additional point to consider, I think, is that although all of the drivers lead to environmental and social benefits, do they do so simultaneously? So, in other words, at the local level, do we see social and environmental trade-offs, or are the areas where we see reductions in deforestation also the areas where we see reductions in poverty? And to answer that question, at least for community forests, we've not done the analysis for the other drivers of change. We looked at whether municipalities with community forests outperformed other municipalities. And we defined outperforming municipalities as those being in the blue quadrant, which had higher reductions in deforestation and poverty alleviation in contrast to the rest of the municipalities. And this is in contrast to the municipalities in the gray quadrant, which mean that they're underperforming. And what we find when we actually put this into a kind of impact evaluation framework is that if you were in the blue quadrant, you were 51% more likely to have had community forestry. And this is in contrast to municipalities in the gray quadrant, which were 30% less likely to have community forestry. So what this is telling us that, at least in the case of community forestry, it's reducing both deforestation and poverty at the same time. And I think that's really important in order to think about how to best manage trade-offs, which are often there as well, right? I think we need to better understand whether these things happen in time or co-occur in time and space. Now, a key question, which I think is perhaps important when thinking about how these different things kind of operate in time and space, is to understand how they interact. And we have at least some evidence that in the case of community forests, outmigration might actually lead to community forest management being less effective. And this comes from some work that colleagues have done in Mexico, and we were interested to try and see whether we would see a similar pattern in Nepal. And I think, at least in my mind, it makes sense that if you have community forestry, which is essentially reliant on community forest institutions, and you have a large proportion of that population migrating and not being able to be part of community forest management, or at least change the structural composition of the communities, then you might actually see some of these effects actually translating into reduced community forest management effectiveness. So areas with higher levels of outmigration are actually areas where community forest management is less effective. And we were keen to try and test that. And that seems to be at least the pattern that we're seeing. So this is still very much work that is in prep. So what I'm graphing here on the y-axis is the community forest management effect on poverty alleviation, and on the y-axis essentially a gradient of migration. So as you go from left to right, you get increases in international outmigration. And what we're seeing is that as international outmigration actually increases, the effectiveness of community forest management on poverty alleviation is actually decreasing. So that seems to suggest that community forests in these areas with high levels of migration are perhaps less effective. Now, I'm not sure, there might be some crowding out effect as well, which we've not accounted for, but this is something that we're currently very interested in and trying to look at in more detail. I think in comparison, we see something very different when we actually look at protected area effects on poverty alleviation. So we actually see the opposite. So as international migration increases, the effect of protected areas on poverty alleviation also increases. And one potential for seeing this is that as communities receive remittances from migrants, that are able to invest some of those remittances into the tourism industry and infrastructure that they have, which helps them to maximize those incomes. But I think ultimately the key point that I want to make in this slide here is that drivers of social and environmental change can act very idiosyncratically. And I think we really need to think about context. And I know that I'm not the only one who's said this. When we take Brazil as an example, and we did something very similar in the case of Brazil in terms of how the data set is structured, so working at the level of municipalities and being able to compile social and environmental data at the level of municipalities and link that to expenditure in social protection programs, we actually see that cash transfers and rural credits, which were part of this broad social protection program in Brazil, lead to actually very different environmental and social outcomes in different parts of the country. I think one of the things that is really striking here is that you get key areas where things have perhaps not worked so well for people in the environment, and areas where things have been very, very successful. And in some instances, those overlap, and in some instances, they don't. And I think one of the key things that I think we're going to be doing next is to try and understand why this is happening. So can we get a much better understanding of how different social, environmental, and political contexts help to shape the way in which different interventions operate. Right, so just to recap, the main points that I really wanted to make were that interventions with smaller average effects can have larger effects at scale, and we see that when we start comparing the effects of community forests, protected areas, and migration, in Nepal at least. We also see that socioeconomic processes can have similar or even larger effects than specific targeted policies. So this is certainly the case of outmigration in Nepal. And context matters, right? Drivers of change can interact in idiosyncratic ways. And I think to better understand the way in which different interventions help shape transitions to sustainability, whether it be in the case of conservation or restoration, I think we really need to better understand how these things interact together. Right, I think I'm going to now move to some of these current points and challenges. I think I hope I've convinced you of the importance of looking at multiple things simultaneously. I realize that the title of the talk is a little bit of a mouthful and perhaps not very clear, but I think really it's about trying to understand the kind of multitude of effects and outcomes that different things can have. And I want to spend the last part of the talk talking about some of the research challenges that colleagues and myself are coming across. The first one, as I said, was measuring social outcomes at scale, and also measuring reforestation, which I guess is reforestation or restoration, which I guess is the kind of new agenda, or one of the new agendas. So the first challenge, I think, is that, at least when it comes to forest landscapes, we're much better at measuring environmental outcomes than we are social outcomes. I think we now have a number of different satellites that are measuring deforestation on an almost hourly basis at incredible spatial resolution. So we're able to track deforestation very carefully. But I think social outcomes in most low and middle income countries continue to be measured using representative household surveys like the LSMS and the DHS surveys, which tend to be collected, let's say, every 2 to 5 years or so. Or the national census, which tends to be collected every 10 years. But this means that we have very highly variable temporal and spatial resolutions when it comes to social data, which makes it difficult to track outcomes across space and time and to link them with particular interventions. Now, in the case of Nepal and Brazil, we were able to do that because we were able to look at the effects of different interventions on multiple outcomes, because the temporal and spatial resolutions of these data sets essentially overlap. I think one of the most promising things that is coming down the road is the combination of remote sensing data with survey data to essentially model what is happening in areas for which we don't have any social data. So essentially imputing poverty data to fill different gaps. I think this is a really rapidly growing field, and I've seen a number of different papers that are trying to do this. I think there are some questions still to be answered about how, for example, reliable they are in terms of measuring poverty, whether they're essentially just able to detect differences between rural and urban areas. But this is really, I think, a space to watch, because if this is able to essentially kind of do what it says it's going to do and generate kind of edge-to-edge maps of poverty and changes in poverty and well-being, economic well-being, then I think this opens a new kind of opportunity to really try and better understand social and environmental dynamics at scale. The second question is perhaps more methodological, which is how do we deal with multiple uncertainties? So these are models, and we also generate uncertainties in our estimates of effects. And so what happens when we put a model into, essentially a model that is modeling poverty into a model as an outcome into a regression model? And how do we model a model, essentially? I might be overthinking this, but it's a question that I've been asking myself in the back of my head. The other point that I want to make is that I think measuring reforestation is really, really hard. It's something that I've come to realize more and more, and I think I think it applies to other restoration agendas too, not just reforestation. This is a paper that came out earlier this year, and I think it's at least in my mind really a landmark paper, because it's able to accurately differentiate, relatively accurate to differentiate between different types of forests, so natural regenerating forests and plantations. It really is a great achievement, but I think one of the concerns that I have is that it only looks at change between the years 2000 and 2012. And I say only because I think this is a phenomenal achievement. But the issue is that essentially it's already 10 years out of date, right? And I think that really creates a problem when we want to try and understand perhaps more recent changes or how emerging agendas are essentially going to be able to address some of the challenges that we're facing in terms of environmental degradation and social justice issues. So one alternative is to use global products to conduct analyses. And so the question here is whether reliable or whether we can reliably use global products to conduct national or subnational analyses, which is where, let's say, most of impact, I think, at least in my mind, most of impact evaluation is done. So this is a question that another colleague of mine, Dhanapal Govindarajulu, has been asking. So what he's been starting to do is to compare different global forest products, in this case, at a subnational level in India. So this graph shows the Globe forest cover data set, which is Landsat based, and the Copernicus European Space Agency global products at the level of districts in India. And you might think that when you look at this relationship, this correlation, all is well, and that you're able to use these data without any issues because they match with each other, so to speak. But when you actually map some of these spatially, you find that they're actually very spatially biased. So both products seem to be either over or underestimating forest cover relative to each other in different parts of the country. And so that generates a problem because you're not entirely sure which forest product to use. You have to validate them locally, which is a huge amount of effort. And again, it begs the question, if we're thinking about using Matthew Hansen's data set on deforestation or other global data sets, about how reliable they are in terms of being able to be used at the national level. So one of the things that Dhanapal has been doing is to actually try and combine other global data sets. So in this case, ground truth points and a database for planted trees with open source algorithms to generate his own reforestation maps, and seems to be doing or having quite some success with doing this. But again, I think it's kind of pushing the frontiers about what we as, let's say, kind of a scientific community that's interested in impact evaluation is able to do, right? And whether we need to essentially open ourselves up further in terms of trying to get input from people that have expertise in remote sensing, people that have expertise in modeling, like I was showing you before with the poverty estimates using remote sensing data. Right, so I'll stop here. I hope you found this interesting. We'll be doing quite a lot more work to better understand how different drivers of reforestation lead to social and environmental outcomes as part of a new 5-year project that's going to be starting in January 2023. We're going to be recruiting 2 postdocs and 3 PhD students over the next few months. So if you're interested in working with us or know somebody who might be interested in this, please get in touch. We're in the process of setting up websites and kind of different media presence. But in the meantime, we have an interim website and a mailing list that you can join using this link in the QR code. And of course, you can also email me using the email address below. So again, I'll stop there. Thanks again for listening, and thanks to everybody at Team Counterfactual for inviting me. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much, Johan, for that talk. Excellent and perfect timing as well. So I will just hand over to Rachel, who will start moderating the Q&A. And I see we've got quite a lot of questions coming in the chat.
Yes, feel free to send your questions in the chat and we'll try to keep up. Our first question comes from Paul Ferreira. He's saying, you encouraged us to examine effects on multiple outcomes. Do you see any threats to developing a credible evidence base when scientists and practitioners can explore large sets of outcome variables and focus on the ones for which the effects look interesting?
This is a really good question, Paul. I think, to my mind, this goes back to some of the points that you and Julia and others have done about pre-registration. And perhaps that's one way of doing things. I think, to my mind, ultimately, this is not about kind of data mining. I think we shouldn't. Shouldn't replace data with good theory, and I think, and kind of try to understand kind of key agendas, and that might be actually very diverse agendas, you know, which might focus or not focus on poverty, but focus more on environmental justice issues, right, which are perhaps more difficult to measure. I think the point here is about trying to think about sustainability as a multidimensional issue and to kind of broaden the way in which we think about impact evaluation, to think about that more broadly. But I think you raise a really important issue. I'm not quite sure I've given you a good enough answer to that.
Great. I'll follow up with another question from Paul. He says, in your comparison of the scaled up effects of community forests, outmigration, and protected areas, did you consider that protected areas are more often assigned to larger contiguous areas, whereas individual community forests may be isolated from each other?
The short answer to that is no. And I think, again, this is perhaps about using deforestation or reductions in deforestation as a proxy for conservation success without considering, you know, the kind of landscape integrity. I'm kind of trying to think on my feet about how you would do that. You might. The problem is that in many, you know, for protected areas, we have very good information about where protected areas are in terms of space, right? We can access the World Database on protected areas, but there's nothing equivalent for community forests. And so I think this is a call for perhaps making sure that we have better information for spatial information for different types of interventions.
Great. I have a third question here from Sheila. She asks, do you think stricter forms of protection like protected areas could cause outmigration?
Perhaps they can cause outmigration. I mean, protected areas have definitely been kind of linked to displacement, forced displacement or economic displacement. I think it's very difficult to see this within these kind of large data sets, which is why I think this is, you know, conducting these large data sets is not the only way we should be thinking about impacts and kind of impact evaluation. I think it provides us with an ability to look at the way in which things perhaps interact, because we're focusing on kind of we're leveraging the large amounts of data that are out there. But I think to better understand some of these dynamics at the very local level, we have to integrate these large-scale analyses with more place-based case study work, whether that be quantitative or qualitative.
Staying on the topic of protected areas, our own host Johan A asks, can you elaborate a bit more on what types of protected areas there are in Nepal? Are people allowed to live within the protected area borders, or has protected area establishment meant relocations?
So my understanding of protected areas in Nepal is that many of them are strict. I think you do have a mixture of some sustainable use protected areas and certainly buffer zones around protected areas. But again, kind of figuring out some of those dynamics is again difficult without looking at things with more detail on the ground. I think part of the issue with perhaps impact evaluation when looking at protected areas is that once you start dividing things up into different types of protected areas, you end up with relatively low sample sizes. So how certain can you be about the effects that you're seeing? Again, which is why I think kind of combining more kind of case-based study work with large-scale analyses is really important.
Great. I have another question from Paul. He says, you estimated the interaction of CFM and outmigration. Is your design aimed at estimating the causal interaction of the two variables, or just the moderating effect of one on the other?
So I've been thinking about this in terms of more as a moderation design, but I'd love to talk to you about it more. I think one of the challenges, and this is one of the things that I think I was saying previously, is that ultimately finding data that match in space and time in order to kind of get the, let's say, gold standard impact evaluation design is very difficult. And I think, you know, the whole series of assumptions that are made about, you know, what comes before what and after. And I think at least one of the things that I've struggled with when doing some of these analyses is to ensure that the causal patterns that we're seeing are in the direction that we think that they're happening, and to think about the kind of robustness checks that are able to do that. But again, it kind of feels like you're trying to, you've got a model and you're trying to prop it up with different things or different analyses that in combination help to tell that picture more fully.
Great. We have a question from Matthew. They ask, do you think the challenges of measuring restoration impacts are mainly due to these programs being newer? For example, we will get more data as time goes on, or are there more fundamental differences with the way data on restoration programs are collected compared to conservation programs that make identifying the outcomes more difficult?
That's a really good question. I think they might be newer. I think they're certainly newer than some of these programs are certainly newer than some of the conservation programs, and certainly they're part of, I think, of a kind of new reinvigorated agenda. I wouldn't say that restoration's in and of itself a new thing, but I think there's been certainly more emphasis on this and funding behind it. But I think this kind of talks again about the need to get better data and more accurate data on reforestation, which is so difficult to measure, but also on the kind of social side. So I think it's a combination of it both being newer, but also perhaps us not necessarily yet having the data.
Paul actually had a follow-up to his interaction question. So to go back to that for a minute, he says, for your study, the key is whether you're trying to replicate a 2x2 randomized experiment, both CFM and outmigration are randomized, or just a single treatment randomized experiment.
And so I thought about this as two separate experiments. But it might be, I mean, one thing that I was also thinking about is trying to partition the data into areas that had community forests as well as protected areas, and to try and look at whether those areas do better or not, or community forests and high migration, and see how that works out. So that would be a kind of, another way of thinking about moderation and interaction. Sorry, I'm getting lost with all the questions.
Yes, I'll have a follow-up from Johan A for you next. She asks, related to that question about time lags, would you expect different time lags in an intervention leading to poverty eradication outcomes versus environmental outcomes?
I think it depends a little bit. I think you can have, so when you think about deforestation, it's a very sudden event, right? It can happen very quickly. By contrast, I think reforestation happens much more slowly, so you have a much longer time lag. And I think with kind of social outcomes, I think you can again have changes that happen quite quickly, but the drop can happen as quickly as the rise. And I think the problem is that we have, and I can't really think of very many data sets that are able to map these kind of poverty and well-being dynamics over a long period of time, let's say over 10 years or 5 years, but on a kind of annual basis, to see how these things kind of go up and down over time. Because it might be that you just measured, you know, your social outcomes after a particularly hard year, right? And so that then means that things are lower. And so again, I think getting those dynamics is really important, but I think it's really hard, really, really hard.
Great, I have another question. Do you think that poverty alleviation and the mechanisms you mentioned, for example, remittances and tourism development, could be mediated by differences the level of development have in each country?
Yes, I think so. There's certainly, at least from my understanding and from having talked to some colleagues, there is a kind of network effect, right? So that you might be in a community where a lot of people have migrated, or one household has migrated, and so you know that person and the household, and they're able to tell you how things work, and so therefore you're then in a better position to migrate as well. But again, I think disentangling these effects is really really difficult. The kind of dynamics, right? The household level decision processes that shape, do we migrate or don't we migrate? How do we, you know, when do we migrate? These things are, and the kind of trade-offs, decisions that are being made. But because of course, I think in many instances people might take loans, right, in order to migrate, which they then have to pay back, and that puts the household in a kind of precarious position. So I think these decisions, kind of livelihood decisions, or livelihood strategies are really, really complicated. And I think it's a great point, and I think we need to understand them better. Again, I don't think it's an easy thing to do, because, or at least at scale, right? Because household surveys are really expensive. They take a really long time, and oftentimes you can't go back. So they tend to be, one or two, maybe one wave, two waves, if you're lucky, three waves. But to look at four waves and how these things feed back on each other as well is very difficult.
Manuel asks a question about the different factors of some of these successes. So they ask, would you agree that the factors that drive permanence of existing forests are not necessarily the same that drive the long-term permanence of restored forests? And then they follow up by asking, what are the key methodological issues that need to be tackled in the context of forest restoration?
That is a really great question. And one that at least parts of it, I've kind of been thinking about. I think, and I mean, I can see that James Erbaugh, JT, is the next one down the line. This is something that JT and I and another colleague, Rose Pritchard, have been thinking about as well, in terms of what makes these, what defines a sustainable reforestation, or what defines a sustainable forest transition. And I think longevity, kind of permanence of forests, has not necessarily always been part of that framework, because there are examples where you've had forest transitions, so you've had increases in forest cover, and those have then essentially been reversed. And I think you're right, the differences that lead, so the factors that lead to kind of long-term natural reforestation that happens because of agricultural abandonment might be very different to the ones that lead to successful kind of active restoration. And I think trying to understand what defines these different dynamics, I think is really important. So yeah, I think it's a really great question.
We have time for about 2 more questions, so I'm gonna get James's, who was next in the chat, and then Sebastian's. So, oh, sorry, I was muted. We have time for about 2 more questions. I'm gonna get James's in the chat next, and then Sebastian's. So James says, one of my concerns is that when program evaluations compare across intervention modalities in the conservation space, they tend to overlook how different interventions are implemented. To what extent do you think this matters? And will the Sustainable Forest Transitions Project investigate heterogeneous impacts driven by implementation as well as intervention modality?
That is another great question. I think it's very difficult because trying to get information about actual implementation is very difficult. But if you're interested in this, which I am, then we should try and think about how we can do that. So yeah, absolutely.
Great. And our last question brings us back from Julia and Paul's talks. And they ask, both Julia and Paul, RCT mentioned in the previous talks, randomized controlled trials as a new methodological frontier in the field. I am wondering what your perspective is on this, for example, in the context of multiple outcomes or forest restoration programs.
Okay, that's another good question. These are all really great questions, and they're really making me think of my feet here. I think in terms of RCTs and multiple outcomes, I don't see an issue. I think you can think about putting multiple outcomes into a randomized controlled trial. I think from a design perspective and implementation perspective, it might generate a little bit more difficulty, but I don't see conceptually, at least from my understanding of RCTs, that you can do that. I think RCTs are really good at isolating the effect of a particular intervention, right? I'm not entirely sure, and I'm happy to be told that I'm wrong. I'm not entirely sure they're able to help us understand heterogeneity. So why is it that certain policies work in certain places and not in others? It might be that you're able to generate an RCT that is so large that it is able to incorporate heterogeneity. And that might be the way to do it. But I think it would be, I'm not entirely sure how you would be able to convince a funder that you're going to do that, or that you're going to run 2 RCTs in order to compare, right, the outcomes. I think that the closest example that I have is the way in which people were comparing vaccine effectiveness in relation to COVID. But again, that was done kind of post hoc rather than integrated into specific RCTs. Although I think there was one program that was trying to do that. So I don't know, but I don't know. I mean, perhaps Paul has some ideas, and Julia have some ideas about this as well. Not just me.
All right,
Yeah.
and I think I will actually unfortunately have to stop the Q&A at this stage. So thank you so much, Rachel, for moderating it, and Jonas for responding. And I would just like to share my screen again to quickly tell you about what we can be looking forward to in the coming month. So before we close, I just wanted to say that on the 4th of October, so the first Tuesday of October, we will have Professor Erin Sills from the North Carolina State University, and she will give a talk on synthetic control methods in conservation science. So really looking forward to that, and I think it will be a great complement to all the other type of methods that we've been hearing about so far in this seminar series. So finally, I guess I would just like to thank Johan again for his brilliant talk, and Rachel for the help with the moderation and discussion. And then, yeah, thank you all so much for now, and looking forward to see you in a month.
Thank you so much.